Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shemeka Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-hosts Shemeka Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Brian Kilmeade, co-host of Fox and Friends and the author of several books, including Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates, Andrew Jackson and the Miracle of New Orleans, and Sam Houston and the Alamo Avengers. His most recent book is The President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and their battle to save America's soul. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Charles, thanks for having me. I'm glad we finally worked this out. Professor Shemeka, great to see you.
Good to see you.
The book is interesting, especially for our current times, and we brought you on, obviously, to talk about that most recent book. But first, I want to know why this book. I know there's a lot of books about Frederick Douglass, and, you know, you can go between Lincoln and TR to figure out which president has been written about the most. It's probably Lincoln, but not often with the two of them together. And what did you find unique about their stories that made you want to write this particular book?
One thing I was doing, I looked at George Washington's Secret Six and his spy ring for about 20 years. I never thought I'd write about it. I just loved studying history, and I was doing mostly sports at the time anyway, but it was in my backyard. And then after I put that book out, I thought, what would be the next major moment in American history that's, I think, underexplored, underappreciated? And I thought when Jefferson took on the Barbary Pirates, which were Islamic extremists, which were the terrorism relates to the terrorism that we're dealing with today. And then I always thought a war that nobody reported on, but always fascinated me, was the War of 1812. Obviously, the White House is burned, our army's invisible, the British want revenge, and we end up winning at the Battle of New Orleans. And instead of the Battle of Baltimore, I decided to do the Battle of New Orleans and get to know Andrew Jackson a little. And then I thought, what would be next? Well, not many people know Texas history outside Texas. So that brought me to the Alamo, and I'm doing that series on Fox Nation called What Made America Great. And I was doing the Alamo, but everybody knows the Alamo was this terrible disaster and everyone died. What happened after that they ended up winning, which brought me to the Alamo Avengers. So I'm trying to find out some unplowed ground within these well-known stories. And the Battle of San Jacinto was that 17-minute battle where basically they finished off Santa Anna, ended up capturing them. And then that left me at the Civil War or the Mexican War. And I thought, man, do I really want to jump into the Civil War right now for obvious reasons? By this definition, it's divisive. And I thought, and how do I do it in a way that's not the same thing that Ken Burns just did on video and that David Blight just did as Frederick Douglass? So I thought, what about if I talked about the unlikely scenario that these guys would even amount to anything in their lives, especially Frederick Douglass, born a slave. But, Lincoln, this terrible existence, abject poverty, illiterate parents, mom dies at 9, dad kind of abusive, totally against education. It would be against the law to teach Frederick Douglass education, and how they had these parallel lives, and then how they would coincide at the end, and the sadness that Lincoln gets cut down before they could do their arguably the most important work, and perhaps you come to the conclusion that I did. We might not have needed the 1960s if Lincoln could have survived the 1860s. So I thought if I tell these stories in a way that moves, that doesn't get caught up, no offense, Professor, in the Harvard jargon that maybe slows the story down, if I can make sure it's 100% accurate, revolving around its quotes, that maybe people would appreciate the story and get a perspective on our history that maybe they're not getting in the newspaper.
Oh, wow. You summed that up greatly. I mean, I think there's two really important things. I talk a lot about important points in the country's history and important information that's being put out there, but it's being told, like you said, in an academic way so regular people don't read it. But also, we're at a time where we're battling about education, and you telling stories that everybody knows. We're bringing parts that they don't really talk about, and learning something new about it is really important. Yeah. I talk about those parallels you talk about, and it's really important because you make a point. These two men, I mean, you wanted a great example of what, forget about the negatives we hear about America, but the great example of what we say the idea of America was, or anybody can make it, regardless of your background. We hear people say that and people kind of roll their eyes and him and haw, but these are two guys, right?
Yeah.
All the things you said about Lincoln, people know Douglass. If you say former slave, everybody knows, what that entails, but people don't really understand how hard life was for a lot of people. So they weren't supposed to end up being the president and the most photographed man of the 19th century. So, that is telling, and you put that parallel together really well. So I want to start by, talking to both Will and Shemeka about what they think is really important. Before we get to the meeting, the fact that the two men met and spoke and how that went, but just their lives. When you read about them growing up and the hardships and, obviously being enslaved, both losing children when they were young. I mean, Frederick one, Lincoln several, but what that said to you about American life at the time, or about what they overcame, and how we can look at the way people look at America and look at life today and learn something from it. Shemeka.
Well, first, let me say that I didn't get to complete the entire book because I do better with signed hard copies.
That sounds
all right. I need your address.
Okay, great. But what I appreciated was the parallel, the comparison, how you would write about one and then go and write about the other. I think that helped me kind of see the similarities between the two, and that they weren't worlds apart like people would try to make it seem. That stood out to me about how you wrote the book. And one of the things that caused me, though, to think a lot was when you talked about Frederick Douglass not even knowing what the word abolition meant. And I thought about, I don't even think I've thought about it in that way, that if you didn't have the ability to learn, how much you just were lost, and I thought about people who now take education for granted and how much they're missing out on simply because they won't take the time to learn. And now we have the ability to do it freely, but we take it for granted. That stood out a lot to me. And one of the other things that stood out to me was that I know my history as a Black person in America. I can count back. I know that my great grandmother was born into slavery in 1830, I believe, Hannah Guest. And so when people talk to me about this isn't my country, this is my country. I can trace back my history of people that were born here. And so I feel like I'm a part of America. And that's one of the things that I liked about Frederick Douglass, is that he felt like he had the right to be here and he deserved everything that anybody else deserved in this country. And so those things kind of stood out to me in the book. And I was able to kind of look at my own life and say, I agree with that. I understand that. I can see why he felt that way. And so I just appreciated being able to even see that, and the way you put those, parallel together.
Yeah. If you don't mind, Charles, do you mind if I follow up?
Go right ahead.
Okay. So, Shemeka, a couple of things I really appreciate. Number one is what you just said. I think is so important, and I didn't think was a question. When I was growing up, and you wouldn't know my education, I wouldn't know yours, but we never whitewashed slavery. I remember Roots being on. I was in 6th or 7th grade, and the brutality of slavery. I remember the conversation in this country. I think it was still the most watched ever, and the movies that are surrounding it. And in class, which was a mostly white school, but a working class school, they always talked about the brutality of it, the evil of it. And I never felt like I was being whitewashed or told, oh, it wasn't that bad. In this story in particular, I think it's kind of interesting to your point, is that when colonization comes up and Lincoln says, the best thing is we made a huge mistake. I'm going to have some Black leaders come to the White House, and I'm going to explain to them that I got this colonization offer. I want you to take some money. I'm going to cut a deal. I'm going to get you guys housing. I'll do the transportation, and I'll go back to a country of your choice. We're sorry our founding fathers brought you here. And Frederick Douglass in the North Star is writing, he's offended. I'm an American. How dare you send me to another country? I don't know anything about those other countries. Right. I want to be here. I want to fix this one. And he's offended by Lincoln. Sorry about that. And he's offended by Lincoln, the thing, and that most people were, about colonization. And people point that out. Take this guy's statue down. Take him off in elementary school. He was for colonization. Not really. I know, number one, people evolved. And number two is, I wouldn't be surprised that he was doing this to show the American public, I tried everything. We have to learn to live together. And this, because it was so unpopular, it was such a bad move that he said, we can't start over. This is us together. Let's learn to respect each other, live with each other, and live in a free society. But Frederick Douglass was offended by that, the thought of going somewhere else. And the thing is, too, when he went overseas, he could have stayed. He could have sent for his family in Canada. But he wanted to come back and free the 4 million others, not worry about him, worry about more than that. I thought that was awesome, even though he got fed up and was about to leave before Lincoln was elected.
Will, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I read the book. I enjoyed the book. I do think that the point that's being made in a lot of these conversations is that history sucked for almost everyone. And I do think that that's something that most people don't really understand. I mean, in terms of not just things like enslavement or torture if you were captured in war. I mean, that's how most Black Americans came to be here. But I mean, that's also something that happened to white, galley slaves, for example, in the Middle East. That's why we ended up fighting the Barbary pirates, by the way, to the shores of Tripoli. The pirates that were based in the Middle East at that time were slave traders. And I assume these would be mostly Black and Arabic people, if you think about it in contemporary racial terms. But I mean, they would sail from the northern coast of North Africa, and they would grab American and French boats and take anyone that looked like a fighting man into captivity to be a slave, essentially, to do something like row the boats they took into war. So we got tired of these random foreigners grabbing our citizens, and we ended up invading the entire place and taking it over. So this kind of thing was extraordinarily common throughout history. I mean, the uniqueness of the West when it comes to slavery is that we ended it, which I think the book does a pretty good job of conveying. But I mean, just a lot of people, I think the brutality of history in the United States has become associated primarily with Black and Native American. So, I mean, if you talk about whipping or hanging, the idea would be, well, that's what was done to brutalize our ancestors. And that's very true. We had it worse than white Americans. But I mean, those things were just part of history. I mean, I'm actually including stuff on lynching in my next book. Along with deep academic jargon like history sucked. But in 22 of the states, I mean, there were more white or Mexican Americans lynched than there were Blacks. Like, before you had judges, you just sort of had posse. If someone was accused of rape, all the men in town would get their gun and their rope, and they would go catch the rapist and hang him in the downtown. So obviously not endorsing that, although with that particular crime, you'd probably use a bit more of it. But yeah, the book does a good job of summing up that kind of thing. It's a fascinating relationship, really. I mean, there's some questions I have later on. What would have happened if those sort of Lincoln, General Sherman, Frederick Douglass reforms had been allowed to actually occur in that era, rather than, Reconstruction ending and the KKK era in the South beginning. But I mean, yeah, the book's a solid summary of some things that people have generally forgotten. I mean, one thing I bring up in my classes when I do end up discussing history is women couldn't vote here or anywhere else till about 1920. So when you talk about that civilized era where women were equal to men, you could legally rape or sexually assault your wife. I mean, you vote. That's been 100 years for the planet. So we've come a long way pretty fast. That's worth keeping in mind. We don't live in log cabins anymore, praise God. So.
But Will, don't you think part of it is you took the effort to find out where we've been, so you're not going to overact to where we are? It seems like everyone thinks history started yesterday.
Well, I think that's a very important point. I mean, so in terms of, we're here to talk about your books. I didn't want to sort of ramble on, but I mean, in my classes, I teach what's called POS 101, Intro to Political Science, Intro to History. And I've had people ask these questions at a pretty good state university, like, why are they hanging that white man when we talked about like the gallows and the old English tradition and so on? You have to explain, well, because that's what you did for a very long time. If you stole someone's horse, there's only one judge in the whole county. So I mean, what's probably going to happen is you're going to sit on an ass in jail for a year, and then they're going to take you to the Central Square and kill you. This wasn't something that was reserved for Black people in most cases. But yeah, without knowing that, I think a good way to put this would be we've focused so intently on recent history, sometimes deservingly, but the Black civil rights movement, the hippies in Vietnam, obviously on the Caucasian side, feminism, that we've almost forgotten much or most of the rest of history. So, I mean, If you were to ask an ordinary group of college students to identify Malcolm X, everybody could do it. The Wright brothers, almost nobody could do it. Even on the black side, Benjamin Banneker, nobody could do it.
Right.
Like these lions of the past, anyone from Britain, Churchill or Chamberlain couldn't do it. So it's great to talk about Martin Luther King. And again, he's someone you could talk honestly about. That wasn't a perfect story. But, I mean, it's also great to talk about the guy he was named after.
Well, here's a good segue to that, though. Because you talk about, we got there quicker than I thought, but I knew we'd get to current times. So you talk about this history. So there's this big argument. We just want to teach true history. True history. You know, that is a big point of contention for me. Because what is true history? Some will say it's black history. Some will say you have to teach slavery. I would say, and we can go back to your book. So I like the fact, and I say this all the time, talk about the ugliness of America if you want to, but you don't get to take stuff out. So I joke that William Lloyd Harrison was the first anti-racist, right? So because, you know, he hated slavery so much that he's like, there's no way to fix this country. You need to burn it to the ground, get rid of the Constitution. And Frederick Douglass used to think that way. But as he read more and got more nuance and got more context, start to love the country, he's saying, I don't think that's the way to go, right? And William Lloyd Garrison's like, I can't talk to you anymore, right? You're a sellout, right? So here's the white man telling the former slave that you need to go somewhere because you don't know how to do this. There's John, right? That's not only is that ironic, but then you have right. You got John Brown saying this is so bad, it's moving too slow. We need to burn this down. The abolitionists hated Lincoln. They were like, he's moving too slow. You had all this, you know, you had Garrett Smith. You write about this in the book. And many of these things I knew, but most people don't, right? You know, people talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, but they don't understand why it came to be. But my point is, like, I've got a book on the 1619 Project, right? And I point out the fact that there's nothing positive about it. How is it that you wrote a book about slavery, Jim Crow, anti-black racism, and they don't mention Frederick Douglass, by the way, but barring that, they don't mention abolitionists. If you learn in school the way they want to teach the bad of America, which I'm not saying don't teach it, there is no positive there to round out that history. It's just whites hated blacks. It's just slavery and then Jim Crow. And then their whiteness wouldn't allow anything else. Were there any whites fighting against this? Shut up and sit down. I'm teaching true history over here. And that is the problem. So even in their effort to say what's wrong, and they're sneaky because what's wrong is true. So they say, am I not teaching truth? Well, you are, but without the context, is it really still true? So you point some of that out in your book. But if we're talking about now, don't you think that that's part? What do you think about that, Brian? You're seeing them tearing down statues and not even knowing who they are, right? You know, you find out that some of the military people that they're tearing down were black or were abolitionists and people fighting for freedom because they don't care.
You had so many great points, but one of which on the statues, I'm in Rochester and I shot a special for it. And if you guys want to check it out on What Made America Great, it's on the Fox Nation special. It's the last one I did. I went up to Rochester where he lived the bulk of his free life. And during the Black Lives Matter riots, they took out Frederick Douglass's statue. They ripped it out of the pedestal and leaned it on the fence. I'm thinking, if you really knew what you were talking about, you'd make another statue and put up another Frederick Douglass statue. When you're taking out Frederick Douglass, obviously we got a little bit irrational there, but it was done intentionally. So now they've boxed up Teddy Roosevelt. There's a box around Teddy Roosevelt in the Museum of Natural History. Thomas Jefferson, after 180 years, gets moved out of City Hall in New York City. And thankfully, they sobered up in San Francisco. They were going to get the name Abraham Lincoln off schools. But here's the thing. I think the story is evolving. Everybody evolves. I imagine all of us are a lot smarter and well-read, and we have different beliefs now than we did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 15, 20. Isn't that the story of somebody who wants to make the most of their life? Who wants to help more people by learning more things and getting different perspectives? That's what I see in Lincoln. Lincoln would be in the Stephen Douglas debates. He basically wants freedom, but he doesn't think blacks and whites are equal. Right. That's what he grew up with. You could argue Benjamin Franklin had slaves, but he ends up dying. He's an abolitionist. You could see the second term of Abraham Lincoln. He's basically running on an abolitionist platform. So I'm willing to accept people get smarter and they learn more in life. Why are these people in the streets ripping down statues? Because these people had times in their lives, or they ended up believing things that we would consider not up to our standard today.
Well, here's another quick one though. To those anti-racists, here's another point. Don't they also, you say people evolve, which is true, but don't they also say that unless you're, especially if you from the kindy wing, if you're not actively doing something, then you're equal to the racists. But there's a period of the transition, right? So you were here, you weren't doing the right thing. You're transitioning here, but you just don't jump there. So if they catch you in the middle, then you're still a racist because you haven't fully, committed to the John Brown action level. You're just saying, well, slavery's bad. That's not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of just very briefly, like a lot of. I think even it's great to hear that Honest Abe moved more toward what we would think of as morality later in his life. I mean, that always inspired me about Lincoln in particular, great guy. But it's also important just to be blunt. Like almost no historical figure would meet kind of the dorm room feminist moral standard of today. Like most of these guys were killers. Like if you were a warrior class man, you were expected to spend a great deal of your time fighting other people brutally. This is true from ancient Rome through the Knights. It was true in Black West Africa. We can use a little more of it today, to be frank. This is true during the U.S. Civil War, Revolutionary War. I mean, it wasn't until Vietnam that you started seeing exemptions to the draft, which still existed for things like being in college. But I mean, the point is that, to a certain extent, reading one history book really can make you woke. Like, you go through and you see, well, George Washington had slaves, he was an imperfect man. Reading 15 history books will make you deeply cynical about human nature. You'll read what was going on in the Muslim world at the same time, Africa at the same time, Europe at the same time. These are all warrior cultures. I mean, Japan was a samurai culture of swordsmen until we opened up the ports by force by sailing our warships in. So, I mean, this was reality. Almost no one in this era would strike us as moral, and you can either reject all of history. Caesar had sex with little boys. It's a fact. So did Socrates. Almost all men at that time were either pederasts, I guess would be the term, or sometimes submissive homosexuals. Not that there's anything wrong with that. By today's standards, that was Greece and Rome. So you can either accept those facts or you can reject everybody. And it's coming for the new generation, too. Like, I mean, Martin Luther King was extremely homophobic. Again, I love the guy, just like Lincoln, who I'm sure was also homophobic like everyone else. But, I mean, Martin Luther King, there's a famous letter where someone says, I have these desires, these urges, you're the great man, the reverend, the doctor, can you tell me what to do with them? And King is saying, well, that definitely is a problem. And as I recall, recommends things like shot therapy. He had no patience for it whatsoever. And, I mean, once you get past the people we have as statutes now, and you put up MLK and JFK and Gandhi, all those people were deeply flawed men. I mean,
Absolutely.
Mahatma Gandhi was extraordinarily racist. He hated blacks and Englishmen. So, I mean, you're never going to get that perfection. Not every statue can represent a single mom from 1976 or something like that. So everything would have to come down, or we'll just have to understand the past in context.
Right. I agree with that. I think about even my own family saying something like my mother telling me, don't bring home a white man. Like, this is my mother telling me this in the 90s. So, and I never would say, oh, my mother is racist. She's a terrible person. I just think times have changed. And like you said, if we look at these men from those times and try to compare them to what we feel like a man should be today, which of course I disagree with. I think feminists have made men to be, bitches. So, I mean, this is just the time that they were in, and this is just who they were. So I don't think we should be going back and taking down statues because they don't fit who we think people should be today.
Yeah, I mean, no, it will be a nation of pedestals. I always thought that the one perfect person, I guess, was Jesus, and they nailed him to a cross. So I don't know, that didn't go well either. Right. So that's what we're really going to be looking at. I never thought we have an era where we thought we were going to judge history instead of studying history.
Right.
And that was so cool about comparing different people at different times, how they interacted with each other, and what they meant to that generation, ours. I love, Shemeka, what you said. You said, well, my lineage goes back to slavery. Well, then you helped build the country, literally helped build the country. This is your country. So generations kept building, and now you're this person who achieved so much. I just did a story about tenement housing in the 20th century, the 1900s. How Teddy Roosevelt started walking the streets, and we found all these little enclaves of first generation immigrants right out of Ellis Island, just living in these oppressive, horrible situations. and these slumlords were taking money from him, and it was a horrible situation for first-generation Italians and Irish and Jews in this area, and it was horrible. And they finally had, Teddy Roosevelt came out for his 2 years when he was mounted to police commissioner. He started exposing life for first-generation immigrants, and a lot of them ended up laying the groundwork for the next generation. I remember my second generation on the Italian side, my mother's father was an optometrist. His father was a laborer. And before that, they left Italy impoverished. They hopped on the boat they had enough money for. It was supposed to go to Argentina. They ended up on Long Island, and they made the best of it. But every generation improved. It just so much. The African-American generation, that is the ultimate last to first situation. So learn your history, respect it, but take part in ownership of the country because you deserve it. And once we take ownership together, we'll be on the same page. But there's a lot of people who are learning that 1619 stuff in the CRT that says America is built on stolen land off slave labor. That's not really a conversation that can be productive.
Well, I got to get back to your book, but I got to end there. After all of your comments, I think I have the perfect tie-in. So Will made a great point about saying that one history book can make you woke. And you ended it with bringing it back to 1619 and CRT. And the problem, again, I have is no positives and lies of omission. So on Thanksgiving, BLM says, you're eating your dry turkey on stolen land, right? So now all of a sudden, even if you want to buy the argument, it's all about anti-black racism. But now these other groups want to weave it in. It's about, don't forget LGBT. And now all the black people are like, down with the Native Americans, the indigenous people. Actually got an email saying happy Thanksgiving. Here's a link to learn about indigenous people. So it's funny because Will and I are on the same show that day. I think it's the day after Thanksgiving on Fox. And I'm looking at Will and I'm like, so Will's part Native American. There was a guy from Oklahoma, he's from Cherokee tribe before me. And I'm thinking, so my paternal great grandfather walked the Trail of Tears, but he wasn't Native, right? So now we have half educated black people saying, well, the Native Americans are part of us too, and you're still in their land, ignoring the fact that some of their ancestors, mine being one of them, were forced on the Trail of Tears as slaves because the 5 civilized tribes didn't want to give them up. But they don't know that because the 1619 Project and CRT, and no one wants to teach that. So again, we're back to the fake full history. But because it's becoming predominantly the way they teach, they believe this, they know just enough history to make them angry. And now they're just going around creating these memes and sending this out saying, look, we're all together, acting like, history is just that clear cut. And they're all some good guys and bad guys. And the bad guys are all the white people. So
the white people, the one commonality is the white people are the bad.
Right.
That's not the way to come together. That's not the way to get white people to understand. If there's a way to balance the playing field more, I don't want to speak for white people spokesperson. We want to do it. But when you make me the enemy and tell me it's my fault, or as Condoleezza Rice says, you tell a 4-year-old kid that they're an oppressor, and you tell a white kid he's an oppressor, you tell a 4-year-old black kid he's a victim, you're not doing anyone any favors. And one of the comments that in studying Frederick Douglass past my book, he says, in looking back at my life, some of his good friends were white. He said, I'm convinced that kids don't see color, which brings me back to today's headline, CRT. Should we be telling second graders that what I just said and how much we're forcing them to see color when there's no reason for them to do that?
And we're not teaching them to read. Let's not leave that part out. Right, Shemeka?
Right.
You don't get to read and do math. You just need to know that the white man is bad.
Because black people can't do math. It's racist. That's just crazy.
Well, no, the USA Today just had an article today saying, is math racist? I mean, we know blacks are not excelling as much, so it must be race in it. That's right. The problem. It can be no other cause but racist. But for white people are, putting some funky stuff in the math to make us not learn it.
Yeah, it's
we're giving too much to the Asians.
What'd you say, Will?
Whatever we're doing, we're giving too much to the Asians.
16, 19. It's the same kind of network lineup of bullshit. I mean, the most successful people when it comes to doing math are Asians and black immigrants. But that's just
they're white adjacent. Remember?
Well, that actually is kind of the idea. I mean, a bunch of school districts have started classifying certainly Asians and sometimes West Africans, Jews, Indians, so on as white. So you have like all of the white people of all the different colors that are performing well, and then you have the group that are classified as minorities, which I guess would just be blacks, Latinos, maybe natives. So I mean, like Washington Post ran an article about this pretty famously, like a year ago. We need to start dealing with multiracial whiteness, where they addressed the problem of all these successful minorities that identified with white culture, which just means middle class has a job culture in America, because this was such a threat for kind of the coalition of the fringes on the left. And that actually really is kind of a problem. Like when you look at that organized, like that Obama coalition, the question is, what holds together, say, a sex-positive radical feminist and an Islamic immigrant? What holds together a union guy and an illegal immigrant? A black guy and an East Asian guy. These people aren't just all, patting each other on the ass and saying, go teammate in day-to-day interactions. So what holds them together has to be this idea of the man or the white man. And if that ever fades, the coalition goes away. I mean, like you're seeing this now where 40% of Hispanics said with any competent Republican in the next election, they're voting GOP. This came out today. And if that ever happened, if those figures, 25% of blacks, 45% of Hispanics moved over to the Republicans, it's game over for the Democrats for 20 years. So, I mean, I think there at some level is a conscious attempt to stop that. And that's how you get, white blacks.
Right.
That's fascinating. I never thought of it like that. I also thought this, if you're going to talk politics, the Republicans have made no cohesive effort to not pander, but appeal to the African-American urban community. They don't show up. I mean, you could show up and not like me, you could boo me, but politicians usually got pretty thick skin. They got to show up at train stations and make people slow down and give them flyers. But I just don't understand, like, for example, that Georgia race. How did it make any sense that Perdue wasn't walking through Atlanta? Just all he needed was 1-2%, and he just go down there and goes, listen, how can I help? What can I do? Instead, he tried, by the way, he was lazy, didn't show up at the debate. But same thing with Kelly Loeffler. Why are you going for only the people that you know are going to vote for you and try to get them out to vote? Why don't you at least try to unify the country by walking into downtown Atlanta and saying, let me just tell you what I'm about and see if we see some commonality here. And it's disrespect towards the urban vote, and it would be better because it would make people compete for your vote.
Well,
make the Democrats accountable for what they do.
But it's worse than that because what I always tell the GOP is forget about how many people you can win and what it costs to get a vote there. The biggest problem is if you don't show up, the Democrats get to say what you think. And let me tell you, it ain't going to be nice.
That's
right? So the only people talking about you is your opponent. They're like, let me tell you what he did last night. Let me tell you what he thinks about you. And it may be the most outlandish, crazy stuff, but there's nobody there to say, that's not true. And here's my record to prove I'm not that. So now you are the devil and it's your own fault.
Because you didn't even show up.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the things that frustrates me about the GOP. I feel like they think that if they just turn their head and not look at it, not address it, that it'll go away. It's not going to go away. Some things you need to address head on, period, even if it's uncomfortable. And I don't like when people say, well, what's the point? Blacks vote predominantly for Democrats. A lot of times it's just because they simply don't know. I know for me, I had no idea that my values were conservative until I was able to actually be around conservative people and hear them talk and see that they flock to my message, something that I just thought was common sense. I realized conservatives agreed with me. And I'm like, why is that? Oh, my values are conservative. And I think sometimes you just have to let people know. But if you don't go and talk to them, they remain ignorant.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's for me also a big part of it is just the total control. Because I'm from a big city. I think we all are. But I'm from Chicago, like the center of the actual city. And almost everyone that told me things for a good chunk of my life, like middle school teachers, high school teachers, the media, college professors, was on the left. So I just saw the Republicans as sort of the bugaboo on the horizon for a while. Even now I'm an independent voter, but I remember in college I turned in a paper once where I just assumed that the cause of all bad government policies was the Republicans. Like, I was blaming things like the Jimmy Carter shutdown on the Republicans. The teachers like, this is a well-written paper. It's BS. Like, that's not what happened. It seems like you've just been listening to propaganda. But that was actually the case. And yeah, if GOP candidates aren't willing to get out there and kind of make that push, they're not going to get any reward from those communities. It's understandable. It's not understandable. It's not justifiable. But you can see from the perspective of the typical lazy, mildly cowardly individual that just exists as a human, why you wouldn't spend a lot of time in the black community, though. I mean, the analysis would be, what am I going to do? Move the vote from 11 to 14%? If I can get out 3% more of the vote in the suburbs much more pleasantly, I'll have that same boost. So it's understandable, but yeah, you're never going to make the change unless you come. You're never going to win unless you play the game, basically.
Right. My thing is, if I'm a politician, I would like to win and represent everyone honestly. So if I win a vote without any of the urban vote, with getting 6% of the black vote, you'll never look at me as truly representing you. At least I would like to say I showed up at the gym, at the town hall, at whatever the church, and tried. Yeah, I didn't vote for Brian, but he's my guy, and I'm going to run someone against him. But I don't even tell you what I look like. I don't even show up. So it furthers the divide. And that's why I think that we have to get past a point in this country where when your candidate doesn't win in local or national elections, it's not like I lost for 2 to 6 years. We got to go center left, center right. So it doesn't feel like your world's coming to a close. And when you get that position, you don't spank the enemy. Learn how to win and learn how to lose. And I just think and be willing to lose the next election by doing the right thing. I think that's going to be our next leader. Hey, you didn't vote for me, but what do you need? What are the issues? How do I get you on this infrastructure bill? How do I get you aboard here on this? How do I get you on immigration? You need me to build that wall? Can you give me more of a presence when it comes to getting illegal immigrants with a pathway to citizenship? I'm not leaving until I get a deal. And I'm going to alienate the right to do it. And I'm going to alienate some on the extreme left to get it done. And if you hate me after 4 years, vote for somebody else. But the only way to move forward is to get the people to sense that just because your guy or your woman lost an election, you don't lose for 4 years. So right now, the Trump people feel like they lost for 4 years. The Obama people feel like they lost for 4 years. No kidding. And that's why they're just waiting. They're waiting each other out, and nothing gets done.
Well, just very briefly, because I've been
I want to get back to his book, but go ahead.
It's because of these fringe candidates to some extent, where you have like a Trump versus a Bernie Sanders, or even a later term Obama. I mean, it's hard to get back to the center left, center right, because politics has become kind of poison. A lot of people don't want to run. I think everyone in one of these squares has been approached about running for office. I wouldn't even consider it right now in Kentucky. I mean, so it's just it's an ugly business because of everything. I mean, the primaries, you got the total fringe out there. How much are you going to appeal to them? How much are you going to go after, say, the AOC vote as a Democrat? So on down the line.
Yeah, if I was running, I would just want to win. I would be the one that had the draw four in my pocket from a different deck. As soon as they yell Uno, I'm pulling it out.
We don't want you running, Shemeka. You say we don't want you running.
You would get stuff done.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then she'd be in prison. So
for a white collar crime, I've never seen it happen.
For the right ones,
I mean, they're still trading.
Wait. I thought you were from Chicago. Didn't four out of 5 of your governors go to prison?
Oh, I guess, yeah, the governor occasionally will arrest a governor. But I mean, on the whole time on LaSalle Street, Michigan Avenue,
the strong alderman is not going to jail, right?
No, but I mean, like, the 4 highest crime arenas I've ever been in, like the high school rave party scene, college fraternity scene, major city trading floor, and the internet. Nobody goes to jail. People go to jail for a certain set of small working class crimes. We should do something about that.
Yeah. But the book. So an important part of that book is when you talked about the parallels, their background, the similarities and differences. But at some point, it culminated with the men meeting each other, right?
Yeah.
And so talk about how that happened. I mean, you're talking about a former slave going to meet the president, which is unheard of course, and doing it multiple times and not really being that much of a fan at first because he was the first time he met him still in that camp of you're not doing enough. And, like cringing every time he hears his speeches. That's what he gave us, So now they meet. So talk about how that happened and how that relationship evolved.
A couple of things. When you read that Columbian Orator, which they both had, it was like the Dale Carnegie, Zig Ziglar, Anthony Robbins' course. He would teach you how to do a presentation, give a speech, project yourself, win people over. I thought it was amazing. They both read it separately, and then it consisted of people who made great speeches in great times, like George Washington, Cicero, Socrates is in there. So they're reading these books, opening up their minds to great people in history. I thought that was interesting. They had not met yet. But when they do meet, I was amazed that Douglass remembers that Lincoln didn't have time to write his biography. He got assassinated. But the scenario was interesting. He goes to see Stanton first, and Stanton sees him and says basically, well, if you could help me recruiting, it would be great. And basically offers him a job, and he goes, no, I want to be an officer. You give me that commission, I'll do it. And they never actually followed through on it, but continued. Douglass was like, I'm glad to be here. I'll do whatever you say. No, when I go in, these are going to be the conditions. I see what happened to other people, black people, that when they were officers, they didn't get the equal pay. I thought it was amazing by that. Then he gets online at the White House. They talk about how he was all into presentation, too. He dressed to the nines. He worked perfect. He walked perfectly up straight. He demanded respect and the way he presented himself. He gets online, we think all of 10 minutes. And by the time he gets his card to the person who came to see him and said, who are you? He waits 10 minutes and Lincoln summons him. And when he walks up, he's walking past sitting senators, grieving widows. People want to know if their kid's still alive. He walks all the way up there and he looks at Lincoln. And the best I can remember, he looked at him and he said he was way too big for his chair. And I saw every year of the war in his face. And I could see the goodness in him right away. And they engaged. And this is also a great moment. They listened. Douglass was a good listener and Lincoln was a great listener. So that's why he was so smart. And he knew all these stories, had a great memory. But it's great to be the smartest one in the room and be the best listener in the room. And they went back and forth on different ideas. They thought, this man really is giving me respect. And any thought that he was a racist melted away. And he started to see his job, his perspective. And I learned from this something very simple, besides the substance of their conversation, is that you might have opinions of me. You've never met me. I might have opinions of you. I've never met you. People have told me about you. I've read stuff that you've written. So I think I know you, but I don't. How much disagreement would melt away if we could actually engage the people in a truly interested way and find out what they're about. And when they meet, it melts away and they immediately hit it off. And Lincoln summons him again, but he had a speaking gig, and they meet again and they talk about him setting up a way to insurrect in the South and inform these these slaves that they could be soldiers and do what John Brown wanted to do 10 years ago. And he was going to do it until Sherman starts having all the success in Atlanta, and it was not necessary. But they meet another time because he gets invited to the platform. So when he gives his inaugural address, and the last time they meet, after having turbulence getting in still as a black man into the White House, they didn't believe he was invited. He was. When he finally gets word to Lincoln that he's out there, he gets summoned up. And when he walks up, Lincoln looks at him and says, my friend Douglass, what did you think of my speech? And he said, don't worry about me. You got a room full of people, much more important than me. Don't worry about it. And he says, hey, there's nobody more important whose opinion I care more about. Mr. Douglass, what do you think of my speech? And he said, Mr. President, it was a sacred effort. And to me, does that sound like a racist or somebody who really respected Douglass for who he was, and vice versa? And 10 years later, when it was time to dedicate that controversial freedom statue with a black man getting up out of chains, it was chains with a tall Lincoln sitting above him, and it was financed solely by freed slaves. It wasn't the sitting president, Ulysses S. Grant, that's asked to give the speech. The keynote speech is from Frederick Douglass 10 years later, at which time, to paraphrase, he said, from my perspective, he was slow, he was dull in getting to the emancipation of slaves and allowing us to fight for our freedom. But in the world in which he lived as a statesman, he was fast, deliberate, and visionary. So he understood the statesman-president role as opposed to the activist, intellectual lecturer role. So the relationship was fascinating, and he'd go on to deal with, 6 or 7 other presidents, but he'd always be associated with Lincoln, even though he would outlive him by 30 years.
I think it's important to soak that in. So that statue that you're talking about that was paid for by freed slaves, that Frederick Douglass did the speech to commemorate it, is the one they wanted torn down. That's important to note.
Look, Douglass didn't love the statue.
Right.
You can tell he said, I find it interesting, he said.
Right.
Yeah.
And, but, it's an important part of history, just those two facts. And the growth, the way he viewed Lincoln as opposed to the way people view him now is important. But I know it's hard to do, but Will kind of alluded to it earlier. But I kind of want to pick your brain. You thought about this and dug through this history of this for a while to try to speculate what would have happened. I know I have my opinions. Had Lincoln not been assassinated and they were able to try to hold the Reconstruction era together and do it the proper way, what do you think would be different?
Do you want Will to answer that, Shemeka?
I want you to go first.
Okay. I think about this every day. And my theory is we would not have needed the 1960s if he had survived the 1860s. I think Lincoln, if you liked him in war, you would have loved him in peace, because that's where his head's at. He wanted to govern. He knew the founding fathers. He knew the vision, the potential of the Constitution. He knew slavery was the issue of his day and it had to be handled, and to a degree it was, but the hard work had yet to be done. But he's the one who knew it. They talked about flooding the South with teachers and housing. There was going to be an enforcement mechanism. And now what we know about Ulysses S. Grant, how he was underappreciated in his day, even though as a warfighter he was appreciated, but not as a president. And even though he was lauded, he was looked at as somewhat naive, but he wasn't. He was just, I think he was real. And if you put Lincoln with Douglas with Grant, and if you give 3 terms of Lincoln, and which we could have done, and then you follow up with Grant, and there's no Andrew Johnson, who said basically, yeah, I know we fought a war, but I understand the South. You guys go at it. In fact, if you want to wear those Confederate uniforms when you police the streets as a civilian, that sounds good. And if you could let African Americans vote, but if they show up, make sure to hang them. You know, all this stuff would have been, I'm not saying there would have been incidents, but Lincoln would have known exactly what to do. And you can't tell me the man that said, oh, you 7 states are going to leave him? I'm going to uniform and arm an army, and I'm going to keep beating you until you come back. You're going to tell me that he would have hesitated at all to go into the South with the army to make sure blacks had the freedom that they just fought to get, or fought for them to have? I firmly believe that we would have been a dramatically better country had Lincoln survived. I think there was so much about him that was otherworldly, and has not been replicated since.
I have a question.
Shemeka, go ahead.
So I saw a radio host put this, make this tweet today, and I wanted to ask you about it. And it says, guess what Republicans told Douglas? They told him to change his clothes, his vocabulary, and mannerisms, and then they might be more receptive to his ideas. Nothing new under the sun. And I want to ask you about that because you've done so much research on Douglass. And I heard you speak about how he was well dressed and how they respected him. I never heard that he was expected to not be what he was.
I mean, I don't know the context in which you said it, but I can imagine the retort. I mean, the retort would have been, go to hell. No one's touching me. No one's changing me. You don't know what I've been to get here. I'm not going to change for you. And I don't know who said that or why they said that. But I think that people have a hard time, even though it's a dramatically different party in time, that he's a Republican and a proud Republican, that Lincoln was a Republican. And I think people try to forget about that it was the segregationists were Democrat, the Ku Klux Klan were Democrat, Robert Byrd was a Democrat. So I think people have, up until the 1960s, people had a totally different perceptions of the party. They kind of, LBJ flipped the script. And no one's been able to flip it back since, and the Republicans have made a terrible there's been a lack of effort on that side. But I don't know the context. My bad for not knowing that, on which they said it and who the radio host is. But again, out of everything Frederick Douglass did, you're going to pick out that moment that someone's comments about Douglass switching and bring that forward? Is that going to help us bring the country together? Is that even, you have to go reach to go make that relevant today?
Will, what do you think about what would have happened?
What would have happened absent the assassination?
No, yeah.
I mean, I tend to have obviously Brian's line is a good one, that we wouldn't have needed much of the 1960s had the 1860s not ended so abruptly. I tend to agree with that. I mean, the issue of so bluntly, there was a big question of what to do with the black former slaves. There are books about this with sort of hard edge names like the Negro problem. So I mean, when when the Civil War was over, the South, which had been such a different region, kind of that feudal southern area that it wanted to be its own country, had been conquered by the North. I mean, General Sherman once said he didn't leave a building over 3 stories standing. You know, a fourth of the fighting age men were dead. And then you had the slaves who were now free and surrounded by sort of the majority poor white Southerners that they hated and been hated by for generations, centuries. So the question was really what to do. And there were real proposals made. I mean, the reparations idea of 40 acres and a mule was actually something that almost became U.S. government policy. Whether or not you think that's justified, yeah, I have no doubt that Abe Lincoln would have held down the Confederacy, frankly, for quite some time and tried to move Black America towards some kind of normalcy, some kind of stable status. We've seen countries that did do that, by the way, without going into full wonk mode. I mean, Russia freeing the serfs and so on. So you can't imagine that things would have been worse. What happened in the South actually was one of those odd historical tragedies. So we had the Union Army in the South. We had a large number of top Black elected officials, mostly Republicans, for this 10-year period, this 15-year period. It turned out a fair number of the slaves had learned at least trades, blacksmithing and so on, during their period of toil. So you were moving toward this relatively equal society. Then as part of we've already talked about how history sucks. But then as part of a corrupt political deal, the Northern Army was essentially recalled. And that's when the real night-riding era of Ku Klux Klan dominance and sort of horrific abuse began. And it obviously would have, and that had many, many consequences in and of itself, including some good ones long-term, like the Great Migration, where half the Black people left the South and moved to the North. But could all of that have been avoided by a president that cared a little more and a little more genuinely about the topic and worked to fix some of those things? Yeah. And that is why reparations has remained something people talk about. Like, it wasn't just a BS magical idea, whether you approved of it or not. It was an actual proposal. We held these guys in bondage for this period of time after, their side lost and they were shipped over here. This is what we could do. We could give them the standard yeoman farming spread and see if they can compete equally with the whites around them. And that chance to compete was never granted because of historical whimsy, because of the loss of Mr. Lincoln.
Well, I'd hate to be, I'm shocked to be more cynical than Will. And I guess it's never happened before in the history of the show. But I'm going to end this kind of in a way that will prompt us a second episode. But I definitely think things would have been a lot better. But I don't buy the lack of the need of the 1960s. I mean, even if you talk about that terrible political bargain, that was 1876. What did you say, Shemeka?
That terrible wave of feminism.
Or that. But no, that was 1876. So I think Lincoln lives and things would be better if Grant or someone like him is behind him and advise you a little bit more time. But, I thought he would be a great statesman, but part of being a great statesman is he would be willing to compromise some things. He wouldn't let people secede, obviously, but he wanted those Confederate, he wanted the people who supported the Confederates once lost to still be back in the Union, right? He wanted America to be one again.
Yes.
So he would have let them in. He wouldn't have caved like Johnson and just said, you can be back in government. I think the worst part was allowing that to happen. And then, of course, what happened in 76. But I think that, he wins another term or two, that solidifies Reconstruction. Maybe Ulysses is maybe if that happens, Grant doesn't ever become president then, right? So
maybe not.
Yeah. So I think that we get, what Grant did, but Grant did some great stuff, but a little bit better. And maybe, it dies down slower, but I think you still have, the 1880s and the early 1900s.
But Charles, you mentioned that 10-year period. Will, you mentioned the 10-year period. What if they lose a 20-year period?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the racists end up being the minority. I know it's a weird way to say. If you're still racist and holding on to that Civil War, pre-Civil War attitude, you end up standing out rather than being with the standard of the time. And the fact is, Andrew Johnson not only did not enforce, I think he was for letting the South go back to life the way it was.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he was just the worst.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think the reparations, quickly to the reparations thing, I've always been a proponent. I think that was the right thing to do. It was 100%. It would have been, immeasurable how much better it would have been than affirmative action or something that they duct taped together and including other people that didn't even, weren't even part of the problem you're trying to fix. I mean, I get why they were trying it at the time. It's what they knew in 1960, but obviously reparations would have been the better answer. But if we would have gotten strong reparations at the time, I don't know whether it would have been the passage of the 40 acres and a mule, or what it would have been. It would have been better, but I don't, it's hard to say. But I think that would have been the right thing. It's just separate from the talk of reparations now. I think that's not even the same conversation.
Yeah, I don't even know how you would do that, but it is in the conversation. I think Joe Biden brought it up. I think he's got a committee on it right now.
Good
how
luck
you do that, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much
you want to
money
leave us with anything?
I don't trust a thing Joe Biden says, but I would hope that if the 1860s would have been different, then the 1960s would have been, different, including that wave of feminism.
And for you, the last wave, right? You didn't need a wave after that, right?
Gosh, that one was terrible by itself.
Well, I mean, like, the first wave, I mean, the waves of feminism, like, the first one is kind of like women should be able to drive and vote. The second one was women should be able to work jobs and have orgasms. And the third and fourth one are women should be able to be men. I think that most people have a strong issue with kind of gender theory. And like, I would never on a date open with, I'm a second wave feminist, but I mean, I kind of am. Women should be able to.
But I think 3 and 4 is really women should be men, and then women should crush men. That's where we are now.
Three is crush and 4 is be.
Right.
Basically, like 3 is cut the society for cutting up men and all that college campus crap. And the gender theory stuff, like I saw like someone we're all friendly with, Colin Wright on Tucker the other day, just breaking this down, like X% of millennials don't think sex is real and so on. Like, this is one of those weird, real issues that sounds culture warish, but could lead to us losing to the Chinese real quick. So, I mean, that's fourth wave feminism. Sex and gender aren't real. Just
exactly. Well, we can't hold Brian much longer. Definitely, the invitation is open to come back, talk about one of the other books and some other things. I didn't get into the generals. I want to talk about, Sherman burning his way to the shores and how no one teaches that because, that was helpful to blacks. But, it's been great talking with you and getting more nuances on the book. And he is Brian Kilmeade.
And let me just add this. I'd like
to
thank you guys. It was fantastic. I love this conversation. And if you wouldn't mind giving me your contacts to Michaela, I know she set everything up. This way I can get a hold of you when all this stuff pops up in the real world on Fox. And especially I got the radio show and I got Fox and Friends and I'm doing the 7 o'clock in 2 weeks. I do that all the time, filling for Tucker. So, and sadly,
Tucker owes me the race crazy conversation.
A potentially best-selling book about a lot of these topics.
There you go.
There you go.
All right, let me just give the book again. The book is The President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and their battle to save America's soul. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. My pleasure.
I got a country to save. Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.